Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this discussion. We welcome you to the second webinar of the Collab Matters webinar series. I'm Zivi Jamal. I'm the Communications Director for Samuhika Shakti, and I will be your host for this discussion. Before we dive in, I just want to give you a quick snapshot of what is Samuhika Shakti and Collab Matters webinar. Collab Matters is a 5-part webinar series brought to you by Samuhika Shakti and Sattva Consulting. Samuhika Shakti is a Bangalore-based collective impact initiative of 12 organizations working to enable the informal waste pickers of Bangalore to have greater agency to lead secure and dignified lives. Sattva Consulting, a global impact consulting firm based in India, currently serves as the backbone organization for Samuhika Shakti. And Samuhika Shakti was initiated and funded by H&M Foundation based out of Sweden. Over the past 6 years, Samuhika Shakti and Sattva have been deeply involved in facilitating collaboration among the 10 diverse implementing organizations. We have Bal Raksha Bharat, BBC Media Action, CIF, NBU, Hasirodala, Samba Foundation, Social Alpha, Sparsha Trust, Udyam Learning Foundation, and WaterAid India, all working to address the complex and interlinked challenges faced by Bengaluru's informal waste pickers. This journey has been anything but simple. It has brought moments of breakthroughs and moments of strain, recalibrations, pivots, shared wins, missteps, and the slow, steady building of trust. Very important. Each of these experiences has shaped how we work together and has been essential in us moving closer to our shared goals. Today's session, Anchor, Advocate, or Administrator, Unpacking the Backbone Organization's Work in a Collective Action for Real Impact, will dive deeper into understanding one of the most significant pieces of a collaborative, the backbone. The organization that holds the center, nurtures trust, aligns partners, and keeps a collective moving towards shared goals. To lead this conversation, I'm going to introduce you to our moderator, Arjun Bahadur. He's a principal at Sattva Consulting and has many years of experience anchoring multiple large-scale collaborative efforts. He's also the executive director for Samuhika Shakti. And for this discussion, we have with us Shailja Mehta from Dasra, Lakshmi Patabi Raman of Center for Exponential Change, and Akshay Soni, from who used to be at the Nudge. Both Lakshmi and Akshay have had stints at Samuhika Shakti. Lakshmi was the first executive director for Samuhika Shakti during phase 1 and got us started. And then Akshay took over her role in the latter part of phase 1. This is when the Nudge served as the backbone for Samuhika Shakti. And before we begin, just quick couple of hygiene points. If you could add your name and if you could add your organization name to your profile, that would be great. If you are open to keeping your videos on, we would request that. But please keep your audio off. That would be really helpful. Q&A and questions. If you have any questions, please put in the chat box. But we will address them during the last 15 minutes. We have 15 minutes for Q&A. We'll address them there. And in between, if you have any questions, we're happy to take them in the chat. But we let the conversation run for the first 55 minutes till 3 o'clock. And with that, I will pass it on to Arjun. Over to you, Arjun. Thank you.
Thanks, Zibi, and very warm good afternoon to everyone who's joined. And I know doing this right after lunch means that people will continue to trickle in and join us as we get started. But as Zibi said, respecting the people who joined on time, we will get started with this conversation. And I have a fantastic panel with me. Lakshmi, Akshay, Shailja, are 3 people who will bring an immense amount of experience in this space, and I'm looking forward to this conversation with the 3 of them. Collective action today, and just 2 minutes to set context, and then I promise you will deep dive into some of the questions. But collective action, I think the need for collective action is greatly increasing, and in my experience and in my role in the current capacity that I'm in, it's about at least 2 to 3 new conversations with organizations who want to drive collective action. So there is definitely an increase in the uptake and and the desire to learn more about collective action. Some will argue that maybe that isn't enough. Some will argue that what about the costs of collective action? Some will even say that is it even collective action or collaboration or collation? And I think around all of that, I think the one thing that's very consistent and at the heart of any kind of collective action is the backbone organization. And I think while there are enough conversations on the why, the what, the how of driving collective action, I do think that very often an important and an integral part of the role of a backbone either gets neglected or gets taken for granted. And so today, I think the focus being on trying to understand a little bit more about what is a backbone organization, why is it needed in collective action, what is the role that it plays, and how does the journey for a backbone really evolve in the journey of a collective. So with that context, I'm going to jump right in. And Lakshmi, just maybe I'll start with you. And let's keep it very simple. What is a backbone organization? And really tell us what is the role that it should play in any kind of collective action.
That's kind of misleading, Arjun. That's not a simple question at all to start with, right? But I'm going to take a shot, and then, Akshay and Sharja, please feel free to add on if you want to. But to me, I know the term backbone organization kind of originated in the collective impact initiatives. I know there's a definition out there that describes a lot of what a backbone will do. It's an integral part of all collective impact initiatives. But to me, it could be known by many different names, right? We at the Center for Exponential Change often refer to them as system orchestrators. Others call them a secretariat. Some call them system support organizations. By whatever name it's called, I think the role is essentially one that keeps things moving forward towards a shared purpose. As an organization, it is somebody whose day job it is to make things happen in a faster or a more efficient manner. And I kind of shy away from calling it a secretariat because it almost kind of reduces it to the mere operational administrative aspects. I think it's way more. Obviously, there are things that structurally a backbone will do, but I think this is a role that is equally structural and equally relational, right? So obviously, you might be involved in designing of the collaborative, setting its strategy, guiding it, helping it pivot. It might be in external facing communication, advocacy work, building narratives. I know a large part of the work is also looking at how you report shared success, how you enable learning, enable knowledge to flow easily among various parts of the network. It's on all of that is structural. But to me, a lot of the work is relational. It's about building, maintaining relationships between various parts of a collaborative, various actors, funders, implementing organization, communities. It's about negotiating and transforming relationships between all of these people to keep things moving forward into that shared agenda or vision that you may have. So I see the role as really something that will evolve. It's something that's going to be very agile. It's not a very prescriptive role, right? Because none of the work we do is going to be in very controlled environments. So as things around you shift and change, as relationships evolve between the various actors, the role is something that has to be very, very responsive. It's not just a passive, I need to do XYZ things, something that needs to transform in tune with whatever is needed to get things moving. So that's my 2 bits, but I would love to hear from others as well.
Super. And let me frame it slightly differently and go to them, Lakshmi. But I think your point is well made, right? And I think because of the various hats that a backbone ultimately ends up wearing, there is always going to be a little bit of confusion in terms of how people sometimes perceive a backbone, and which also makes the role of a backbone harder in any collective organization. The larger the number of organizations, the more you will find people's expectations changing in terms of what they expect from the backbone. But Akshay, can I come to you in continuing in the same frame and to get your thoughts on that? Just to add to a few terms that Lakshmi mentioned and Shelja has added on chat, backbone can often also be called a parent, a moderator, a coordinator, a convener, and we would love to know from your experience, and you were part of the Samuhika Shakti, and so we just wanted, maybe you can share your story and your understanding of how you see the role of a backbone changing.
Sure. So, just in terms of the dominant piece between the roles that you mentioned, I'll start with that. Given the nature, collective impact involves, of course, multiple organizations who are working to a common agenda. So logically, for the backbone, very often it requires aligning activities, managing communication, creating and tracking shared metrics, organizing meetings. Now, all of that fundamentally becomes coordination heavy. So the dominant piece is, of course, coordination. That said, the other three roles that you mentioned are also critical in different pieces, right? Moderator, as an example, very useful, very important early at, in the early stages of the initiative of the backbone for managing discussions, resolving conflicts. That is definitely a critical element. Consumes a lot of time and energy. Consumes a lot of energy, might not consume as much time as coordination. So that is definitely critical, but it's a subset of the broader coordination function. I'm putting it in there. Convening, absolutely. Bringing people to the table, especially at the beginning, and at various times within, towards the end, to figure out what's been achieved, all of that together. So that is also a critical element, but it's periodic. It is not as consistent across the initiative as coordination is. Finally, parent. Now that's the role that we would have the least of, because it implies a hierarchical relationship. And to my mind, at least, backbone organizations are not supposed to have authority over partners. We facilitate, we don't really control. So, in that sense, to me, parent is the least used term. But the others are all, critical in various parts of it. Now, of course, uh, if I go to the way that we practiced it, um, we also, so we started with convening at the beginning, um, which led to a level of establishment of trust, followed by a good amount of moderating. Since most donors, of course, despite good intentions, have taught the nonprofit sector in India not to collaborate, but that's probably for another session altogether. And we ended up, apart from these, we also ended up playing another three roles, three or four roles that I could go over. One was consensus building. Now, it reduces the moderator role in later stages, because if you can get all the partners to come together and agree to something, that makes it a lot easier for later issues. Conflict resolution immediately goes down, and that, as I said, is the most energy depleting portion of the backbone's work, and also for the entire collective, to be fair. Um, the other one we ended up doing a lot of is capacity building. Areas as diverse as storytelling, impact measurement, especially data driven impact measurement, and gender. Not to say that the partners were not doing this, by the way, they all were. But everyone came with, given that we had 10 orgs in there, everyone came in with differing levels of strength on each of these pieces versus other partners, and bringing them on the same page often required some level of capacity building, especially in the middle and lower rungs of the organizations. So that was an element that actually consumed a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of bandwidth for us. And the one that was probably the most painful, I'm keeping for the last, which was crisis management. Of course, I'm sure a lot of people on this call must have heard the ancient curse, may you live in interesting times. Samuhik Shakti certainly did. In June 2023, one of our nonprofit partners lost their FCRA. While we were grappling with whether we needed to replace the partner or we could find local funding for them. In August, just 2 months later, another nonprofit partner lost their FCRA. And then in September, just another month later, the first partner lost its tax exempt status, which basically meant that they came to an end as a going organization in the country. Now, this was a lot of fun within a quarter itself. To resolve this, we brought on board two new partners, which had to fit into what work was being done, and we requested an existing partner to absorb a good portion of the team of the closed down partner and the work that they were doing. So crisis management became an integral portion, consumed a lot of bandwidth. It's not usual, but going back to what Lakshmi said, responsiveness is critical. So you deal with whatever gets thrown your way. And in this particular case, in a quarter, we happened to go over more crises than we did in the first 4 years, the rest of the 4 years put together.
Thank you so much, Akshay. That was a lot, right? And I think what you really kind of brought out is what resonated with me the greatest was the fact that the backbone is a facilitator and not a body that controls. And I think that becomes the approach for any kind of backbone activity in collective. As Lakshmi mentioned, and as you mentioned, I think we've been very clearly, we can see that the role of a backbone is multifold. And, I think the two things that you've kind of highlighted are responsiveness, which also Lakshmi mentioned, but also sometimes an often unmentioned role of capacity building, which very rarely you'll feel get called out as the role of a backbone at any design stage of a collective. But essentially, through the journey of the collective, one often finds that is the role that the backbone is expected to step into. Shalja, I'm going to come to you next. And one of the things that hasn't come up yet, and I want to bring that out up in the open with you and ask your feedback. And you've been a driver and the window seat to a large number of collective actions in the country. Do you see the backbone's role influencing even culture of a collective and in terms of building trust in that collective? And what does that responsibility require from the organization holding the backbone role?
Okay, thanks so much. And before I start, a quick couple of caveats. Thank you so much for having me. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So thank you. It almost feels therapeutic after these conversations because, like Akshay said and Lakshmi alluded to, the kind of crisis management that one goes through in running multi-stakeholder collaboratives. It's nice to sometimes just talk about it and share it with like-minded people. But I wanted to just say that a lot of what I speak about today, while I take responsibility for it, the concepts that I used in this presentation, the ideas have come from dozens of colleagues from the sector, including the people here, hundreds of conversations, myriad documents and studies that we have read, and thousands of hours of programming and experimenting and learning by many. I'm speaking about it and channeling. None of this is just me or Dasra. It is a testament to a lot of the work that we've learned from across the sector, including everyone present here. I think the second piece I just want to bring out, because this has been on my mind for a long time, and I've been looking and studying at it as we reach kind of 2047. There have been grassroots movements that were the traditional collectives or collaborative actions. We are structuring it into a backbone organization, but my heart remains in the understanding that real community responsive work is done by communities themselves, where sometimes there has never been one organization that has been a backbone organization. There has been kind of circular leadership, and there's a call to action and revolution that takes place to respond to very specific needs like the chipko movement, etc. And there is space for everybody to be side by side, these organic movements and more structured philanthropic collaboratives or community-based run organizations and networks also. Having said that, coming to the question that you asked, Arjun, about setting the culture, etc., etc. I kind of hark back to something that I think Lakshmi, Akshay, and myself are kind of pushing back on, saying that the role of the collective action backbone facilitator, builder, whoever you call it, whichever name, is to create conditions for change. Of course, you will set a culture being a facilitator. However, it is to build the trust to then imbibe a certain culture that you all as players will come up with. A large part of what, say for example, Dasra ended up doing in the 10 to 19 Adolescents Collaborative was set the governance of the entire collaborative. Who takes the decisions? Who has the power? If you have an anchor funder that we did, do they get to decide the direction in which the collaborative goes, or would it be the implementing partners, or is it a shared agenda setting? And a lot of that, actually, one has to be mindful of the dynamics of the different stakeholders that then contribute to culture. You know, we talk about things like culture, facilitator, communication as simple terms. However, I have seen that in collective action initiatives, especially with multiple stakeholders, it's a very complex piece, and one has to have real specific skill sets to navigate and moderate what it means when we are saying we set the culture. So it was very important, for example, for Dasra to be agnostic to the different organizations or the methodologies or their solutions, right? I often say this, and this is a Visa Pita phrase that I use, that I feel like the backbone organization is to be obsessed with the problem, not the solution, which means you're always going to keep your eye on what needs to be solved and then find the right partners or right solution providers towards that. You can't be biased towards saying only this solution will look at solving that problem, right? So therefore, it's very important to set, yes, a trust-based way of working, but it's to enable that versus set that, right? Create the conditions for change. Ensure that there are multiple ways of knowing and not just one traditional way of doing. You have to be nimble and responsive, I think, like people have said. I also stress on the fact that one has to also prioritize at some point, ensure that you're not gatekeepers and you are ensuring that not just the partners that you are funding, because let's be realistic, in any collaborative or any collective action or any initiative, there's a pool of funding that you have to give to a choice set of organizations, or you will be delivering on that or facilitating that. But there are multiple other organizations. How may you look at highlighting their work and sharing credit where it should land is really important. So it's prioritizing the voice that is closest to day-to-day operations and the community is also very, very important through this entire piece. I don't know if I've gone off track now, but I'll pause here and hand it back to you, Arjun. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
No, Shalja, this is fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think you've touched upon some very, very important aspects. And I think great segues to build on from here on. But I think I just want to take a minute to I think, the three of you spoke about being responsive. And to me, I think that kind of comes out as one of the key traits for any organization that has to play that role. You also spoke about being an enabler and creating conditions for change. And I think that's such an important aspect, and gaining an understanding that you are a facilitator, as Akshat also mentioned, and an enabler rather than a gatekeeper or a doer. And I think your view of shaping it to say focus on the problem and not the solution, so that you have the right kind of people solving the problem, I think is another important aspect that I have seen in my experience as well. But I think you brought up two things which are great segues for the next part of my conversation. I think you started by saying that it is a role that can circulate amongst others. And, so is it a backbone organization, or is it a backbone role that can be played by different kinds of organizations? And so, Lakshmi, I wanted to come to you and build on that and say, what kind of circumstances typically have you seen that might impact the decision of who should be a backbone and who should play that role? Should it be an implementing partner? Can it be a funder who can play a backbone? Does it need to be an independent organization? We heard Shalja talk about being agnostic to the methodology. To me, it also means like almost a step away from the actual solution building. So does that typically mean that it has to be a third party? So it'll be great if you could help us kind of unpack in terms of other different circumstances which call for different types of organizations playing that role, and what has been your experience in some of that?
Thanks, Arjun. I think it is clearly a role. I don't think to me, it's always been clear that there's a role uh, that you have to play. Now that role could be played by a whole bunch of people. It doesn't, and sometimes we also kind of put ourselves in this box of saying, okay, it has to be this one organization as well. But I actually like to push back on that and say sure, it could be an implementing organization. It could be an independent organization that's not directly working on any aspect of the problem, but is a kind of a neutral third party. It could be a funder because as much as I may not want to, or may want to push a different idea for the future, most collaborative actions are born out of funders coming together or saying, let's do something differently. So that's often where it starts. So it could be a funder as well. And there are pros and cons to each one of these people being playing the role of a backbone. Obviously, implementing organizations have deep amount of credibility with communities, rich experience with a particular issue, knowledge and experience of that issue. Uh, but then on the possible con there could be them playing the role of a backbone. How do they handle conflict with other parts of the work that the organization does? Because this would be just one of the many things that they do. How would they build trust with others working in that space? Would they be seen as someone that's neutral or someone wedded to a specific solution? Um, it also there's structural challenges as well. Limited flexibility in terms of hiring or comp structures, ability to take risk, focusing on the short term versus the long term. So all of these will come. You could say, okay, then let's just have an independent organization be someone who's not working directly on a problem. So Akshay and I have been part of the Nudge. We were an independent organization. I would say Sattva is also relatively independent. You could come across as this neutral bridge builder between many of the implementing organization. You could be the neutral bridge builder between funders and different types of funders and implementing orgs, and also bringing community into that conversation. But then you often start off from a place of relatively low legitimacy among and recognition and trust with the organizations that are closer to community. With funders, it gets quite complex, to put it nicely. There's always going to be either a real or perceived imbalance of power, right? I mean, as much as we can state it, it's not, when someone controls the purse strings, you often lose the ability to hear real feedback or actually hear what people are thinking. People are going to be, and I've worn the hat of a funder, right? People are going to be nice to you because they fear that if they say something that is conflicting with your point of view, uh, they will lose the opportunity to access funding. And it's sad, but it is the reality. So you might keep saying, no, I want to hear feedback, but there's always this question of, have you heard real feedback, or what have you done to make it possible for people to give you frank feedback or have real conversations with you, right? And of course, I think when you're a funder, you're very far removed from the communities that you're trying to serve. So, a lot of the funders' theories of change might be quite removed from reality. They, of course, also have structural challenges. Most philanthropic foundations have very small teams. Do they have the bandwidth? Do they have the mind space to actually devote time to being a backbone? So there are pros and cons. I mean, but there are advantages, right? Akshay spoke about convening being a large part of the role that one plays, especially in the early stages. Now, I think funders have the ability to convene, have the power to bring different people together because they also have the funding to actually invest in convening and bringing people of different viewpoints together. So maybe there's a space where a funder can play the role of a backbone. Um, but I'm thinking that this can actually be a shared role. It doesn't have to, I mean, parts of the role can be played by different actors. I do think it needs someone whose day job it is to make things move along, to keep obsessing about the big question, as we say, or the problem statement, and how, to keep listening and learning to connect the dots. Because often in in civil society space, um, there are assets, strengths, capacities resting among different organizations, which they often are not able to see. But a backbone could actually do this, right? Because they have visibility across the network. Um, so it's I think a role that multiple people, someone's going to obviously head it, but you can bring in others. You can bring in some, implementing orgs could take up some of the work. Your funders could take up some of the work, but and do it in a way that it doesn't become too heavy on governance and slows everything down. And then you spend more time coordinating when it truly starts becoming like feeling like an overhead. But do it in a way that you're sharing power, that you're more of a steward and not controlling different aspects of that role. So that's what I would say, that it's a role that people could. I don't see it as being restricted to one org, to simply answer that question that you asked early on. I see it as a role that someone has to play, but definitely leveraging abilities and capacities and capabilities of others in that network.
Thanks, Lakshmi. And so I think what we are hearing you say is that the role it is about the role, and it is about, I think, what one does in that role. And I think you kind of brought out the pros and cons of each organization, type of organization playing that role, from having the funders having the convening power to the legitimacy of the actual practical experience that an implementing organization can bring in, to the neutral kind of bridge building aspect that a third party neutral organization can bring in. But I think you did talk about the imbalance of power, and that's the other thing Shalja had mentioned earlier on. And I also see Akshay has posted on chat talking about the authoritative route that a backbone can actually end up getting into. So Akshay, my question to you is actually on that, and very nicely positions this question where backbones inevitably will end up sitting at a position of influence. They sit at an intersection of the implementing organizations and the funders very often, and power dynamics can surface from that. So can you talk a little bit more about that? How does the backbone kind of hold back? And I know you mentioned that maybe not setting the culture is one way of doing it, but more than that, what is it that they can do proactively to kind of balance the power dynamics that emerge while maintaining trust, transparency in a collective action?
Sure. So, as you said, Arjun, there is always going to be power at the table that a backbone carries, right? Because at the end of the day, they control information flow, they set agenda, they facilitate meetings. They're the ones who usually report on progress to the funders if they're not the funders themselves, right? Because that is another form of backbone. So at the end of the day, I think it becomes very important for the backbone to act consciously as servant leaders rather than leaders, right? If we are going to use that concept at all, rather than facilitators. So, what are some of the elements that we found worked really well for us in doing that in Samoik Shakti earlier? Was one of them was open decision making, right? We would always explain in as broad a forum as made sense about why certain decisions were made about agendas, processes, data collections. As trust built up, we actually also made it about seeking inputs about it, both proposing something, seeking inputs, and then going back with a refined version so that everyone owned it, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what you're seeking. It's not about you exercising power, it's about you bringing everyone together to align on something that is shared. That's the true nature of a collective initiative, right? Um, that was one. The other was we used to some extent process and content frames, right? We wanted to very clearly separate out when the backbone was talking about process in terms of, you know, let's say, how do we structure this convening? How do we get people together? What is the format to use to try to get it to be more collaborative, more participative, etc., so on and so forth, versus content, which is when we're discussing with each partner about the goals that they need to have for reporting, so on and so forth. In the former, we were basically the expert at the table, but in the latter, we were an equal voice, not the dominant one. And that's critical. You can't, at the end of the day, you have the duty to the common agenda. And therefore, it is important for you to tie partners down also to very measurable goals, etc., all of that. But they are the ones who know what they do very well. And it's important for you not to be the dominant voice at the table, but only to be the guardrail voice at the table to ensure that it's very measurable and it is not going to deviate significantly from what's been agreed to in the common agenda. So that's another one. The third was just, internalizing within the backbone itself, that our primary loyalty, as Shelja also said, is to the common agenda, is to the problem, right? Not to the solution. And the collaborative process. Those are the two things that our loyalty goes towards rather than any particular organization's interests or the solution, so on and so forth, right? Sometimes it basically meant in a meeting pausing as stuff got either heated or certain people were not speaking up and so on and so forth, and ensuring that everyone got a chance to voice opinions at the table to ensure everything is taken into account. Um, Another couple of things that worked really well for us was one, um, being a learner, not being an expert. There were 10 orgs at the table. Each one of them knew their business better than our team could know their business. That was never in question. We were going at it from a learner's perspective. We asked questions to understand rather than to comment or to judge. We positioned ourselves as experts in collaboration. So we would push an org to find ways to collaborate with another. We'd make some suggestions about how that could be done, so on and so forth, but not about how they ran their programs, right? That was not our area of expertise, and we were there to learn so that we could figure out better ways to collaborate rather than anything else. And the last, but probably the most critical element that worked very well for us was an acknowledgement of mistakes, right? Um, Typically, it is very disarming when you acknowledge your mistakes as someone who has a certain amount of power at the table. Honestly, right? You have to be humble about it, not just an acknowledgement for acknowledgement's sake. And partners were very, very, very nice to us about it. We did make our mistakes. We acknowledged them. We apologized, and they always helped us find a better way forward. So all of these pieces worked really well for us. Another couple of things that went just into the process itself was there were multiple one-on-ones that we did before we got to as prep for a single convening, right? A joint convening for partners that ensured that we knew each partner's viewpoint getting into the meeting. And sometimes, if they couldn't necessarily air it, we would, ensuring greater equity at the table for everyone, not just us, but ensuring everyone else also had equity at the table. No partner felt not heard or slighted, and so on and so forth. And of course, it was also driven by this entire willingness to cede control, both of the agenda and to a lesser extent of the dialogue. It needed to be, especially convenings, um, whether small or large ones, needed to be participatory. Each partner was encouraged to contribute to setting of the agenda, airing their issues, and very often partners ended up offering bouquets, not brickbats, to other partners, and that built both trust and enabled equity. So fairly long answer, but at least those are the things that worked for us.
No, Akshay, thank you so much. And I think you've touched upon some really important things, right? I think you spoke about largely about transparency and trust. And I think when you spoke about open decision making, I think you were alluding to setting up a system of transparency where everything is visible and transparent. And then when you talked about creating safe spaces to hear everybody's voices, and getting bouquets and not brickbats, I think kind of talks about that trust that has to exist before we can even arrive there. But I think one of the other important things I think that you've called out, and I also heard Shelja and Lakshmi mention earlier on, is the duty to the common agenda and the collaborative process. And I think that's what it is. But I think this has been really helpful. And I also see that there are, sorry, excuse me, I seem to have lost my screen. And yes, I'm back. Shelja, I'm going to come to you to kind of close this cycle of questions, but I also see that a lot of people have started putting questions on chat. That's fantastic. And I know that some of our panelists are responding to those questions. If they're able to respond, great. If they're not, we will bring those questions at the end of this conversation and make sure that if those questions haven't been answered, we will respond to them right at the end. But in my mind, from what I've heard, is that the role of a backbone is a complex role. I think the expectations keep changing. And Shalja, coming back to you, you also mentioned the different roles that a backbone needs to play. And the question that really I've heard a lot of people ask is, how realistic is it, right? And is it really even possible for an organization to even understand then where the line kind of stops and where they cannot cross, and the tension between what they are formally mandated to do and what the collective informally starts to demand of them. And I also want to talk a little bit about what should they not do and what should not be their mandate, because we've heard a lot of things that seem to be falling into their plate, but are there also things that should never be on their plate? And so if you could help us understand that a little bit from your experience.
That was a lot of questions in like a couple of questions, but I'll try and answer it. But I also just wanted to go back to a couple of things if you don't mind, and which will, I guess, relate to what you mentioned. Is that, we mentioned the role of a backbone organization, building capacity. I think it's so I'm not sure if a backbone organization can build the capacity of organizations in doing the implementation work that they are experts at, right? Those are the experts that you actually on board because of their expertise. I think what a backbone organization should, I think, build the capacity is of the collective to work collectively, powerfully, and where the leverage of coming together, as they say, as what many people say, it shouldn't be 1 + 1 = 2, but 1 and 1 being 11, or where do you take it to a catalytic role versus just a linear role? I think that is a very core responsibility of the collective as a whole. And the driver of that is usually, not always maybe, the backbone organization, given that if they are given the right amount of funding, space, and resources. So that's kind of one thing to say, just to clarify in terms of building somebody's capacity. I think the second thing sometimes I hear or is like, okay, they are facilitators, they'll bring it together, they are the ones who pull the glue, etc. It's not a goosey role. It's a role where you have to be highly accountable. I mean, at the end of the day, each organization is doing whatever they're doing. It is up to this backbone organization, in my experience, that has to hold the entire piece of collective action across stakeholders, across the funders, across the civil society partners, the media practitioners, the academicians that you have, the community members. Ensure that you are sitting on the table in such a way that whatever you're building together is done in a way that each of you can bring your strengths. How do you facilitate that? How do you do that? And therefore, what are the skill sets that a backbone organization needs to have? And therefore, in terms of the accountability, responsibility that one has to have is also immense, right? You have to be able to take the complexity. You cannot get overwhelmed by the fact that there are multiple asks coming from multiple sides, and that in fact should be your strength in how you're going to govern all of this and create a space where everyone not only feels heard, but is able to come to it in a way that they can bring their best selves, best of themselves organizationally to the solutions or the problem that we are trying to solve. So that is, I guess, one thing. The other piece also, and I don't know if I'm going across questions, but you had said it's allowed, so I'm going ahead, is that the different backbone organizations, backbone organizations will play different roles at different phases of collective action as well. Plus, it also depends on the maturity of the field. So I'll give you an example. When the 10 to 19 Adolescents Collaborative started, right, in its early days, it was called the Dasra Girl Alliance. That was when the whole point of funding work around adolescent girls was something that funders were not doing. And it was a big question mark because not-for-profit said that is their most kind of, the group that if you support, then communities change. So the backbone organization, in this case, Dasra, we had no funder had come to us. We had to bring in pooled funding. And today we are able to raise 54 million US dollars, right, for it. Now, today, nobody questions that you have to invest in girls' work, but those were early days. So you can also set an agenda. I think it depends on how much power you take to that. Now, in that, did we say, therefore, the only way to work on it is through XYZ? No. And the second thing is, if you take our journey all the way from 2011 to now, the field, as it were, or the sector became different. Today, are we doing the same work that we were doing earlier? Absolutely not. Now we are only publishing best practices, talking about participation, webinars, etc. We've handed over the work and even the backbone kind of work to different, more proximate organizations who have gone through the journey and are able to do that. Earlier, we were very much involved in the reporting, grant writing, all of that, etc. Right? In the middle, we became a huge initiative that works with the Jharkhand government and the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare when we had to look at policy uptake. Just to round off to say that, again, when you talk about whatever, agile, responsiveness, accountability, the point is that as a backbone organization, you have to be cognizant of the role that you have to play. Are you the right person to play it, and the different roles that you will play based on the emerging field, how nascent it is to how mature it is, and where the collective action initiative is also in terms of maturity and nascency. So all of this has to be kept in mind. Is it a doable role? I think you asked. Absolutely. Is it an easy role? I don't think, but which is it a role worth doing? 100%. Are you going to see change really quickly? Not. Are you going to see change that is lasting? Hopefully, yes. That's the goal through a collective action piece. Is measurement easy? Not, because you're working at multiple levels of systems, policies, mental models, and program traditional ways. So it's kind of diverse and complex, but it should not be complicated after a while.
Shaja, thank you so much for opening that up. And I think 2 points that stood out to me. One, I think backbone, because it's a catalytic role and it's not a linear kind of a role, they also need to be highly accountable. And I think what we would, maybe later on when we have time for questions, one of my follow-up questions to you on that would be, what would accountability for a backbone kind of look like? And maybe, opening that up a little bit more might be helpful. But I think what you made a very strong point was how the role changes during the different phases of a collective. And also the maturity of the space that the collective is planning to operate in. So I think that being a very important point, and I know there was another part of the question that you didn't get to, but I'm going to bring it up again. So I'm going to continue with you as we come into this final loop of questions before we open up and take questions from the audience. One, I would love for you to talk a little bit about what should not be on the plate of a collective. And I think that would be, something important to kind of think about. But I also want to understand, because you have been doing collectives for so long and you've seen an evolution of collectives over a period of time, have you seen handovers of backbone? I mean, does it come to a point where we say that the collective is going from phase A to phase B, and maybe the role needs to change, and maybe the organization needs to change. And what does that transition really look like? And Samuhika Shakti has undergone one of those transitions itself. But we would love to understand, and maybe the audience will benefit from trying to understand the nuances of at what point does it start to feel like we need to now change into a different organization, and what are some aspects to consider in that change process? So again, two questions there. One is that, and the other, of course, is what a backbone should not do.
So what a backbone should not do, I think the list can be quite large, but I will start with saying that a backbone should not do direct implementation if they can help it. It should be leveraging partners and players in the ecosystem who are traditionally doing those pieces of work. What a backbone organization should not do, I think I've spoken to this, and I think a lot of this we can continue in the chat because I might be repeating myself, is kind of take credit, be kind of the gatekeeper, be the only channel of communication with the funders. What a backbone should not do is not design things in isolation from communities. I'm actually, what I'm ending up doing, I'm telling you what a backbone should do, but framing it as not. So I'll just be honest and say, be community centered, don't gatekeep, ensure that you're accountable. I think one thing I want to talk about what the backbone organization should do is, I don't know, I still haven't come up with a right word. It's a mix of savvy and political within the landscape in which you're working, which is you have to recognize undercurrents of things that are going on, right? One can't just be like, okay, this is the mission, we're all one family, everybody's aligned, everyone's getting funding. There is the whole piece of logos and egos, right? Earlier, when I used to, in 2014, these kinds of webinars, I used to say we need to move beyond egos and logos. Today's day and world is where you can create a banner where everybody's logos can come in and everyone's egos are pacified so that you can come together on the table and do it. I'm also being practical, right? I've learned the hard way. So you have to recognize it's not just funder dynamics, it's the dynamics of all the players. What are they in for? What are their gives and gets? We should be very clear about that. You can't just assume because it's a higher purpose, because collaboration as a noun and collaboration as a verb and collaborative as a noun are two different things. And committing to not just partnering and doing collaboration, but being part of a collaborative requires a significant amount of investment even from the participating organization. You have to make your case, you have to say what you're doing, you have to adhere to certain reporting guidelines, you're going to be compared, you're going to have to maybe share your IP, you will have to look at partnering, which again takes resources. So some of that you have to recognize. So you can't be someone who says once you create on paper theory, structures, governance mechanisms, it's all going to go. You have to have one-on-one communication channels, two-on-one communication channels, group communication channels, inter and intra communication channels, formal reporting, informal reporting. You have to have MEL, which is at 3 levels. At a systems change level, if you're working on multi-stakeholder high-level collaboratives, at a program level, and then at that individual population level, because which funder is going to give you funding without that? Very rarely will that be true. So how do you measure that in a way and then ensure that there's some amount of attribution that one shows in a ecosystem where there aren't enough measures only and there aren't enough measurement organizations that can do this. So we had to find 3 different organizations to measure each piece of our work because nobody existed who could do that globally or in India in that sense, right? So that's everything to do with, again, no clue if I've answered all this.
So I think the transition bit, Shalja, in terms of organizations changing organizations between a collective action program, and are there things that you think one should keep in mind during that transition?
I think Lakshmi's put her hand up. I think all of us can answer.
No, Shalja, why don't you finish? I can come in later.
Yeah, so your question is, as transitions, what to keep in mind? I think one of the things that has helped us, again, I speak from experience is doing review exercises, a third party review on an ongoing basis. Even though we had kind of 5-year plans, what benefited us, and it was hugely important for us, and something that we had to then fundraise for, is to do a bit of this assessment of who the organization, I mean, what we end up doing. And it's based on the review. To your second question, in terms of have we handed over and what does it take to hand over? We have handed over to, like, our Youth Ke Bol work, for example, which was around the 1 million youth collective action initiative for access to reproduction and contraception. It got handed over to the Empower Foundation. We did 1 year of handing over, and now we're just looking at documenting again some of the practices and methodologies and the stories and the narratives that we built. Yeah, it was.
Shaja, thank you so much. And I think two things you really highlighted was the importance of communication. And I know it came up in bits and pieces in the conversation so far, but thank you for stressing the importance of internal and external communication by the backbone. And I think the MEL being so important at 3 levels for a backbone to kind of be conscious about and drive. So thank you for bringing out those points. And I know, Lakshmi, you had your hand up, and but I do want to close one loop with Akshay, and then I want to come back to you, Lakshmi, and close the conversation with you, if that's okay. Akshay, I think just on that note, right, one of the things that I've also heard different people talk about sometimes is that if the role of a backbone is to build a collective space, should that role then have a start and end date? And should one of the accountability measures be, if you were successful in building a collaborative, then we don't need the backbone anymore? So is it really realistic to think that the role of a black backbone can shrink or even become redundant over a period in life of a collective action? And if you have any examples of that.
Well, absolutely, Arjun. Uh, to me, the role of a backbone, is very similar to nonprofits. We found an organization to solve a problem, right? And once it's solved, it doesn't really need to exist, at least in the same form. So, an example would basically be the polio campaign. We had Amitabh Bachchan talking about Do Boon Zindagi in his deep voice from 2002. But in 2014, when we declared India polio-free country, that advertisement wasn't really required anymore, right? Awareness had been spread. It didn't mean that the vaccine was not required. It was still required. It didn't mean that the distribution infrastructure should be shut down. It needed to go on. But some elements became unnecessary. The same way we should, aim, in my opinion, to get the backbone down to a bare bone state. No pun intended here. The point is that at the end of the day, uh, any backbone costs money, right? And the more money that is going there, the lesser there is for on ground impact. And like when I spoke about in the first answer, typically the most expensive resources in the backbone are usually involved in moderating, in consensus building, in conflict resolution, right? If the trust is high enough between the members of the collective, there isn't really the need of a third party to actually do that. And that is quite significant. Some of the other elements, like, say, collaborative storytelling, when you have to talk about 10 organizations, collective impact together, it's going to be difficult for any one of the orgs to do it by themselves. So I'm not saying everything goes, but collaborative storytelling can stay, bringing multiple data sets together again for understanding what the true impact of the initiative is, rather than of each organization separately. So some of those pieces are essential to keep, but the cost of trust building, a lot of the coordination, convening can all be taken out, and those activities can be absorbed within the operating members of the collective, to my mind, over time. So if I'm to break it up from a time frame perspective, basically, let's say in the early stage, the backbone is the centralized convener and driver of the agenda, right? We're focused on building trust, establishing common agenda, basic coordination, all of that stuff. Then comes the middle phase of the initiative. There, the backbone is the facilitator, the coordinator, the capacity builder. We end up managing complex work groups, facilitating data sharing between the various partners in the collective, strategic communication that I was talking about, mediating conflict, building partner capacity, all of those pieces. And finally, you get to a stage of the mature collective. By that time, I think that a lot of the job of the backbone can be distributed or embedded within the operating members of the collective itself. Um, the core functions can by then be owned by the network, and the formal backbone can basically maybe not completely sunset, because as I said, those little elements are there which are difficult for the collective to do, but it can potentially become a steward rather than the driver or the convener, etc. All of those elements can actually be picked up by various pieces. Of course, you can have other uh, examples. You can have rotating backbone functions which pass within members of the collective. There are other elements that have been tried elsewhere, so you can figure various pieces out. But on the way that it should function in terms of reducing in importance, that's how I feel it should change across. Of course, now while I'm saying it should happen, it's not easy to make that happen, right? So you start with a few elements from upfront. You build distributed leadership from the first day itself. You can't really have centralized leadership, otherwise it doesn't work. You embed the processes into your partner's work. If it is extra work that they have to do for the backbone, then sooner or later it is a problem, plus it is a lot of energy that's going into something that's waste. So you have to figure out how to ensure that the partner's processes are carrying what you need, rather than or have embedded what you need, rather than it being extra work, because then it becomes sustainable. Again, you have to create a transition plan from the outset, right? We were upfront telling partners that, listen, we are here only to ensure that you can do your work better. We exist for no other reason. That itself created equity upfront and reduced the power at the table, because we said we're otherwise valueless. If you can't do your work right, we're valueless. So you tell us how to make your jobs easier, was the thought process. And that is where transition plans also have to be upfront, saying today this is what we're doing, but later this is what we'd like you to do out of these roles. And we don't think we should be carrying the it's not just about burden, right? It's also about, if collective action is really going to go up in this country to the extent that at least I believe it needs to, and you alluded to when you set the context for collectives at the beginning of the conversation, we need to have everyone not just be a participant, but someone who is basically highlighting how well it works. And they are a voice for collective action. So each partner needs to transition to that. And if you don't set the expectation up front, it's hardly going to happen. And finally, of course, when it does, you celebrate the transition, right? Where you basically are happy that we've got to the mature phase where there is very little requirement of a true backbone, the way that we define the backbone, and more a secretariat which takes care of the little things that can't really be embedded in the org. So that's again a long answer based on our experience.
No, thank you so much, Akshay. And I think by breaking down a collective's journey into three parts, I think you made it much more easy and consumable for people to follow, right? So there is a role at the early stage, a middle stage, and a mature stage. And I think the different roles that you called out kind of grouped everything that we spoke about earlier and the different roles into those three categories. And I think that really helps in kind of framing the thought process. And I think the last point you made, celebration, while I think it's important to celebrate transition, I think in my experience of being part of multiple collective action programs, I think a key role a backbone often plays is making sure that there are these spaces for celebration, and making sure that the forward movement is being recognized and captured, because sometimes in large collectives with multiple organizations, even the organizations don't have clear visibility of other people's roles, and so you often don't end up celebrating the movement of a collective forward, because you don't have that visibility. So I feel like that celebration is really, really integral. Lakshmi, apologies to keep you waiting. I'm going to come back to you finally. I'm going to invite you to finish your comment, when Shelja was speaking. But really, my comment to build on that for you and question is, we've spoken a lot, and I think once we go back and start taking notes from everything that's been said on this call, I think this is really a rich resource of insights and experiences that all of you have shared. But I want to leave the last question to you open, and as a segue also to then start looking at everybody else's questions that are coming in. What have we missed, Lakshmi? What are some of the other pain points that we haven't really talked about, that you have seen in your journey, which one should be very, very conscious of as we think of not just the role of a backbone within a collective action, but the larger collective action itself? But first, please feel free to share your thoughts on the comment earlier.
No, actually, this question ties up very nicely to the point I wanted to make when Shailaja was speaking, or kind of add to what she was saying. I think when we look at what it is that a backbone should do and what they should not do, I think one thing that I've kind of experienced playing different roles in different collaboratives, being on the implementing side, being backbone side, being a funder, now being an enabler. I think there is always a risk that when you play the role of a backbone, you want to be the nice person in the room. Because it is about building consensus. It is about building bridges. And I started off by saying, it's all deeply relational. And that always seems to, one then assumes that you got to be nice. But I would rather be good than nice, right? Because you become such a people pleaser, and then there are conflicting, there could be conflicting priorities, focuses, agendas, strategies, approaches. They don't even have to be conflicting. They could just be different and just a little bit different. And then in trying to bring all of it together, one of the things that I've experienced and observed with other collaboratives is that we often end up reducing ourselves to the lowest common denominator, which is the worst place to land when you have a collaborative working, right? Like collective action, collaboratives, collective impact, any name that you call, when you have a whole bunch of people. Because let's be honest, getting people to work together costs more than just letting people do whatever they want independently, right? But if we want systemic change, we know that different actors have to come together. We know we have to not just cooperate, we have to collaborate. And it takes time, resources, money. But to let all of that go to waste by aiming for the lowest hanging fruit is the worst injustice we can do to everyone, right? So I think what we need to do is, I think one of the roles that a backbone needs to therefore play is ask the tough questions, learn to say no, push back, figure out when things are not working, and know how to cut your losses. So I think that's one thing that we didn't cover is like, what are some of the toughest calls you make, right? Like, how do you say no? How do you, maybe some partnership isn't working, and maybe it's time to let go of someone from a collaborative rather than trying to keep it all together for whatever reasons. Not that someone's a bad actor, but just that it may not be working at that time. I think another thing that possibly that a role that a backbone needs to play is also constantly question the sustainability aspect of a collaborative, looking at the long term, whether it is transitioning the role of a backbone out and then saying, hey, a bunch of people are going to play, or is it looking in the long term to say this collaborative needs to stay together as a collaborative for multiple years? And that is a question that you don't ask. I mean, it would be too late to think of that, let's say 2-3 years down the line. It's a it should be one of the mandated roles of a backbone, I think, is to ask this question and seek answers. I know it was in the chat as well, saying, hey, should you look for more funders, whether it's funders, whether it is getting community, anchoring on the agency of communities and embedding it into a movement where it becomes organic, as Shailaja started off by talking about movements. So I think those are two aspects that I would think of as very, very critical to keep in mind.
Super. Thank you so much, Lakshmi. And I think the way you've closed it just kind of, for me, highlights and underlines the complexity of how people view backbone's role. And I think, right from the point of should they be responsible for fundraising or not, and that's, again, a very gray space and not really black and white in terms of yes or no, because then you have power dynamics that start coming into play, and then you have culture that one has to start thinking about whether the backbone is responsible for not. And I think I've heard all of you kind of talk about the complexities, but I think the clarity has also emerged. And if somebody who's been taking notes like I have, I think there have been a fantastic, rich insights that you all shared. I know we are 15 minutes into time, and I know there have been questions, and I think you guys have been amazing enough to answer my questions and also responding to questions on chat. And so I think you guys have been multitasking. But I will seek help from my colleagues here, and maybe Zibi, you can help us a little bit. But I do know that there was a couple of questions on the chat that I saw.
I think, Arjun, we are out of time. We just have a minute left, but all of the questions.
Oh, we have a minute left. Oh, sorry, I thought we had 15 minutes to go.
No, we ate into the
we ate into that time. My apologies to everybody else. But then again, all the more thank you everyone for responding to questions as we went along. If your question has not been answered, Zibi, can we promise people that we will get it back to them and we'll chase our fantastic panelists for those answers and get back to them?
They've already done the job. They all of them, Lakshmi, Akshay.
Thank you very much. Then from my side, thank you to the panelists. I'm going to hand it back to Zibi to help us bring this to a close. But Shailja, Lakshmi, Akshay, thank you so much. It's been fantastic.
So thank you. I think Arjun, to answer your question, Akshay, Shailja, and Lakshmi have been answering the questions on the chat. So whatever has been asked, I think they've all been addressed. So thank you so much. And thank you, Arjun, for moderating. On behalf of Samuhika Shakti and Satwa, Akshay, Lakshmi, Shailja, thank you so much for sharing those insights, which all of them derive from your deep experience, lived experience of helming backbones at various places that you have been and together. So just a quick note to everybody too, we hope to continue the conversations on all things collaboration in our series. There are 3 more webinars sessions planned, and we will convey those dates and in due time. You can find us on LinkedIn. You can find us, Samuhika Shakti, on LinkedIn, X, and Instagram. Do write to us. We also have a quarterly where you can ping us and where we'll be collating all of these things that has been shared today. Thank you, everybody. And once again, thank you so much, Lakshmi, Shailja, Akshay, and also Arjun. Thank you.